Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Pagan Switchy Corner. My name is Pagan, and I am joined by the wonderful Mortellus today, who is the author of Do I Have to Wear Black? Rituals, Customs, and Funerary Etiquette for Modern Pagans. Mortellus, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here and happy to get to tag on a second book to my name.
Yay! We'll talk about that at the end because I want to hear all about that. But
Yeah.
definitely for today's episode is kind of, I don't want to say taboo, but it's one of those topics that you don't really see regularly addressed in modern paganism, and that is the associations of death and paganism. We see kind of more fun aspects of death where it's like, oh, I'm gonna talk to the dead, I'm gonna honor my ancestors, but the actual acts of death and dying in the funeral and everything else beyond that, that's something that's not really addressed. So thank you so much for writing a book about that, because the book was fantastic.
Thank you.
And folks, if you haven't already gotten a copy, go get a copy because you definitely need it. It is a great book. But yeah, so when it comes to death and pagans, what does it mean to really incorporate death into our practices?
It's funny. I'm reminded by your question of something that Misha Magdalene, author of Outside the Charmed Circle, which
I
is
love
also an
Misha.
amazing book. If you have not read it, when I finished Do I Have to Wear Black, Misha read it and commented to me that um, death is really the one job that a faith practice has. And as relatively new practices, modern neo-paganism really started out on this high note, and now we're at a point where we have an aging generation that's beginning to die, but they didn't leave us anything behind.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of piecing that puzzle together and seeing what that needs to be is not a small feat, let me tell you. But I think that I think that what they said is true. It really is the one job. When we leave out death, then we can't live. I'm really fond of the book The Worm at the Core. If you haven't read it, it's so worth reading. Not a pagan book, but a great book. Um, we joke often that everything a person does in life is about sex or relationships. You're always trying to reach that end goal, but that's not really true. Everything we do is about death. It's
Mm-hmm.
always about our mortality, what we're leaving behind, what our legacy is, and how we'll be remembered. We're always trying to subvert mortality. And I think that really, to be in a practice that wants to be about living, you have to recognize that living is always about dying. It's always about decay. We're always moving toward death. And the thing about a death care practice or death work and necromancy, as it were, is that it's always going to be about life, because it asks us to reverse the clock,
Mm-hmm.
to turn around and look back on where we came from and what we have been. It's about honoring the fragility of what we have and taking those moments to recognize the beauty in dying. That, like a flower, is a fleeting kind of beauty, and it's always dying. But we still find that space to appreciate what it is.
Yes, absolutely. And it's one of those things when it comes to any sort of thing with death. I think a lot of times as humans, and this is anybody from any religious background, it doesn't matter where you come from, we're not comfortable with death. We want to live and live life to the fullest. And so it's really hard, and I think that's hard why and very difficult for a lot of pagans in modern times now to work death into our practice, because we're not comfortable with it, and it makes it very challenging to know what steps we should take. And I think the way that you said that is absolutely stunning and beautiful, and that it's something that we really should be. I don't want to say embracing death because I don't know if anybody's super comfortable with that, but at the same time, I think we really should be aware of it and aware of the fragility of our lives.
I think too that I say this in the end of the book I just finished. Um, we need to remember that, you know, death is not a hunter, death is a gatherer. They're patiently waiting for us at the end of a long life lived. They're not pursuing us throughout our days. They're not waiting in every corner to take us. They want us to survive and live and defy them for as long as we can. I think that death smiles at every one of us that just absolutely turns our nose up at dying. If healers and necromancers and anyone that challenges death for just a few more moments, I think that that has to put a smile on their face.
I think that's a very beautiful way of putting that because it's kind of true. And as you were mentioning that, I was like, it really brought to mind because I work with Hecate and Hel both. And so they really, it was kind of like feeling them almost smile over my shoulder as you were saying that. And I'm just like, wow, okay, well, I like this. I like where this is going. This is great.
I think we have this we have this imagery of this grim reaper with their scythe. Just a scythe is something you take with, right? It's for
Hmm.
harvesting and it's on their terms and sure, there's something good to be had from that imagery, but we need to sit back and remember that death is appreciating what you have. We have a kind of fragile innocence that is beautiful in a way that only death could appreciate.
Hmm.
It's like blowing a bubble. Why do it? It's only going to pop. But we do it anyway, you know?
You do it anyway because it's fun and it's that childlike innocence that we all have to have because if we are stuck in a state of just being serious all the time, it almost really begs the question of what's the point?
And I think that's death, just blowing bubbles and watching our lives be these beautiful shimmering things in the light for just a moment. And there's a kind of joy in that, I think.
Oh, that is stunning. That is a beautiful image. I love that. So, in one of our Twitter conversations that we've had over the many threads we've shared together, you had mentioned that you would love to talk about tree urns and mushroom burial suits
Oh my gosh.
and how cool they really are. I basically told my husband the first time I ever heard about a tree urn, I was like, I don't care how much it costs. I make me a tree when I die. Make me a tree. And I told my kids that as well. So I was like, I don't want a casket. I want to be a tree.
I'm gonna be so not fun right now. I feel bad already.
Oh, don't feel bad. It's okay. You
So
probably know far more about this than anybody else, but I thought that that was just a really cool thing. So I'm definitely excited to hear what you have to say about these and to learn, maybe a little more because you work in that industry.
so I never fail to meet a pagan person who wants a tree urn or a mushroom suit or green burial or that sort of thing when they die. I'll only talk about the first two because we'll just take up too much time for all three. But your funeral director is always going to try and talk you out of those. And it isn't because they don't want you to have them, it's because A, they're very expensive. And I do
Hmm.
mean very. They are unreasonably costly. Two, um, unfortunately, the companies that make those are notorious for not getting them to families in time. So, unless you've arranged for the cost and ordering it way before you die, and even still, they have to send them at need, is what we call it. Like the day you die, the funeral home is going to let that company know that we need them and your funeral is in 2 days or whatever.
Hmm.
They're super notorious for just not getting them there on time, which is really a bummer.
That is a bummer.
But the mushroom suits also are pretty notorious for not actually growing, which makes families really sad.
Mm-hmm.
So lots of problems there. But my biggest bummer piece of information, I think, is the tree urns. So a tree will grow from it. That's true.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're cremated, what you leave behind after the cremation process is your bones.
Mm-hmm.
After the cremation process, we pull out the tray and drag a magnet over it to pull out, casket locks and pants zippers and that kind of stuff. And what's left is bones, which are ground up in a cremulator, which looks like an industrial sized blender. It's
Okay.
literally an industrial sized blender. um, so we grind them up, and that's what you get back. That bag has no ashes in it; it's just bones. Any ash in there is totally incidental, just from like a casket burning or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Bones are almost entirely calcium carbonate. So when you put those cremains, those cremated remains, that's what we call them,
Mm-hmm.
into the bottom of those bio urns, the problem is that trees don't derive any nutrients from that whatsoever. So they don't actually take that material in.
Ah,
Also,
yes. Okay.
at the temperatures at which an individual is cremated, which would be a baseline of 1800 degrees and up to 2100 degrees, there's no genetic material left. You cannot DNA test cremated remains, for example. So there's not really much of you for the tree to take in the first place on an esoteric level. If you want to be a tree, the best way to accomplish that would be with the tree pods, which are still kind of a concept, and
Mm-hmm.
they are even more unreasonably expensive,
Yes.
or to be buried in a simple burial container, cardboard, wicker, wood, and buried in an area that is either a green cemetery that allows for trees or a burial park that has trees, because the tree's roots will actually take up the fluids from a decomposing body. And that actually contains your genetic material and contains meaningful parts of your body. So burial is really the right option if you want to be a tree.
Well, that's good to
Actually.
know.
That's not fun. I know it's not a fun thing to say.
I mean, it's one of those things that you don't, when they advertise it as, this is an eco option, this is great, and you're going to be a tree. And then you kind of look at it and hearing what you've said now, it's like, oh, yeah. Well, if there's too much calcium and the tree's not getting any nutrients with that, or doesn't need the calcium, the tree's not going to grow properly. And then you just don't have a tree. Okay. And so
I do die sometimes, yes.
yeah. So at that point it's like, is it worth it? Probably not. But I would say, what are your thoughts on somebody who wants to be cremated and then just spreading those, we call it, I would say, primarily everyone calls them ash, but I guess it's bone, not ash.
Yes,
And so having that, spread around a tree or a park or somewhere else, is that okay for the climate?
absolutely. It's not hurting a thing in the world. So when you are cremated, your bone, the material in cremains, and that is what we call them in the industry, is cremains, a
Mm-hmm.
portmanteau of cremated and remains. Um, it was determined quite a long time ago, back in the 50s, even, that psychologically people were often troubled by the word ashes because it reminded them that their loved one had been burned. Um, so we shy away from the term just to avoid that kind of imagery with someone who's grieving.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but your cremated remains are going to be, um, gosh, I mean, they're nigh unto sterile. They've been treated at such high temperatures,
Right.
so totally safe. It'd be no different than like throwing a chicken bone in the park after you ate KFC or something. Not different. In fact, the chicken is probably worse.
I was gonna say the chicken's probably worse considering like the grease and everything else. So, uh,
Probably true, yes. Of course, there are some caveats. There are some very, 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 very rare conditions that your cremated remains might still be um, a biohazard risk,
Hmm.
in which case you might be disallowed from scattering them. But those are so rare as to be like front page newsworthy.
Okay, well, that's good to know.
I think one thing that always sort of uh, interests me, just as a pagan person, if we're using the umbrella term, and of course it's not always the best umbrella term, um, is that there's a sort of perception that burial and embalming and those sorts of things aren't appropriate for us or aren't good for the environment and those kinds of things. And there's certainly problems in the industry and things that we need to fix. But I also think it's sort of broadly misunderstood. And considering the fact that embalming is derived from ritual practices to begin with, I think
Hmm.
there's so much to be had there for pagan individuals. Um, I don't know. That's a topic that always intrigues me.
The embalming practices go back to the Egyptian times, correct?
Really and truly, we could trace embalming practices of a kind or another to basically every culture all around the world for most of history. Um, we see it in every culture, and I think too there's this sort of modern idea that embalming is like some ghoulish person injecting chemicals into a body, right? That's sort of the that's what jumps to mind when you think of
Yes.
it. I always encourage people to remember that embalming is a ritual. Embalming
Hmm.
is a practice, not a set of chemicals. Um, Embalming means to preserve or to give a good smell, right? So if
Hmm.
you light a candle in a smelly bathroom, you have embalmed it. Or if you make a jar of pickles, you embalmed. So when we are doing that kind of work behind the scenes, and believe me when I tell you, it's really meaningful work to me, at least.
Hmm.
You have green embalming fluids, which are essential oil based, glycerin based, any other number of things. Um, you can ask that your body be uh, preserved and treated in ways that reflect ancient practices. Um, it could be simply washing and setting of your features, running water through your system, those sorts of things.
Hmm.
So there's all kinds of things that can happen behind the scenes other than, a bottle of formaldehyde, which is what people think of.
Yes.
And formaldehyde's dangerous. Look, don't get me wrong. It is a dangerous chemical, but we also need to understand that we're not like pouring it out in the yard, and it's not like we're injecting pure formaldehyde into a body. We have to do a ton of math behind the scenes because you have to figure out the exact weight of a person, um, the fluid content of their body, and then we are mixing a solution with
Hmm.
water. So your solution tends to be about 8% formaldehyde, and the rest is water. Um, Really, it's an antibacterial type of situation. The body immediately begins to, proliferate bacteria after you die, which can make the body look very unpleasant. And I encourage anybody at all who can manage it to see their loved one in the most natural state possible. But
Hmm.
that's not great for everybody. Not
Right.
everyone can do that. And when we're talking about, oh, by the end of the first day, you're bloating, you're discoloring, you're developing postmortem stain, which is all these like pooling purple stains. The tongue is protruding, the eyes are bulging, those kinds of things. I mean, this is not comfortable for everyone.
No, it's definitely not a pleasant image, but it's it's one of those things that I think that part of it when we really look at it is, obviously we want our loved ones to be pretty and presentable and all that, like you're saying, to make the, everyone comfortable. But at the same time, it's I have had so many funerals that I've attended in my past where everybody looks almost fake because of the fact that they have so much makeup, or the preservation process has made them look that way, and they don't look natural. And the funerals that I have attended, that they were not like that. Yeah, they looked a little ghoulish, but at the end of the day, it's like they've also passed. So I can understand the two, and I completely understand what you're saying, but I am definitely of the mindset that I would never want to look fake if I had an open casket.
Think too, and this is really important for people listening to remember, is that we've all had that experience where we went to a funeral and somebody was like 2 inches deep in foundation and like smelled like a bottle of Lysol and it was all weird, right?
Hmm.
You have to remember that we have an aging funeral industry that consists largely of straight, cis, white males now broaching their 70s and 80s.
Hmm.
These are very outdated practices we're talking about. Today, the broadest swath of incoming death care worker students are women and LGBTQ individuals. And these are people who are really bringing new schools of thought into the work. People who have a very real understanding of how to use makeup and how to treat the body in a way that is not whatever that was, which is
Right.
I would not want like a 70-year-old Baptist man doing my makeup if I was alive. So let's just
Same.
talk about
Oh,
that for
yeah,
a second.
no, that would be a highly traumatic experience.
Right. So just don't think about what the body looked like and compare the practice to that. Remember what the funeral director looked like and that they did that makeup. Remember that part. That's important. I'm out there with like my MAC cosmetics and an airbrush. I'm doing right by y'all.
I love it so much. That's so great.
No, I think it's really important to remember that if you haven't planned ahead for your funeral, and let me ask you right now, you for real,
Hmm.
do you have an advance directive or a will?
I don't.
A
And
healthcare
it's
power
funny
of attorney?
because being chronically ill, you'd
Yeah,
think that I would. And every time I turn around, I'm like, I need to actually get on this. But I'm 36, so it's like, oh, I don't need one. And then I realize, but I'm chronically ill. I might need one.
right.
And especially in today's world, you might need one because
And
of the state of the world.
how about this? Do you have a healthcare power of attorney, or have you pre-planned or paid for a funeral, or like just made arrangements and stuff?
I have my husband is my power of attorney,
Sure.
and followed by my son. And then from there, as far as prepaid for a funeral, no. But they do know what my funeral should look like.
Okay. So let's imagine that tragically you died right now, today. Your next of kin, your spouse, would have to decide everything by tomorrow morning in their grief. They would be deciding all of those things in this moment. And let's say they can only afford to do the very cheapest thing available to them
Mm-hmm.
and they have a direct cremation. They're still looking at, in my state, around $1,100. And these are things that you have to plan on the fly. It's so cruel to imagine to me leaving your friends and loved ones with the idea that you want things like mushroom soup and a green burial and all these things, but you've left them trying to figure them out for you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's expensive and frustrating. Planning ahead is really important if you want anything unusual. But we also like to imagine that we're going to die in a really peaceful way in our 80s in our bed at home, right? Looking perfect and pink like Betty White, I imagine, did.
I hope Betty White did. I mean, let's just give a shout out to Betty White, wherever she may be,
Shout out.
whatever afterlife she chose.
Go get
Um,
it.
I
Donate
hope
some
she
money.
died
Get
that
animal
way. I hope she died in her bed beautifully.
exactly. But we don't all die that way, right?
Right.
And maybe you get into a car wreck, knock on wood,
Mm-hmm.
or not. And if a person dies before a reasonable age for dying, let's say 70 or so, depends on your neck of the woods and what your coroner thinks about it, you're getting an autopsy, period, because it is considered unexpected and unnatural, right?
Mm-hmm.
So here you are with an autopsy, and if they had to arrange for your autopsy out of state, which could happen depending on how close to a border you lived or how overworked your state is, you must be embalmed if you cross state lines
Mm-hmm.
by some method. Now, if you want a green burial and you want your loved one to prepare you for your funeral and all those things, that's awesome. But we're also talking about a situation now where you're asking them to pick you up in that state. If you are not in great condition, that is such an awful thing to put on your loved ones.
Mm-hmm.
So I always ask people to be compassionate in their death planning. Think about what you want and plan for it in a way that won't leave painful, difficult chores for the people that love you most when you die, but also leave a backup plan just in case that
Mm-hmm.
green burial doesn't work out. Be sure to write down that it's okay if they have to take another route, because you don't want them to feel like what they had to do left you unhappy.
Yes. That is very valid information that, I think a lot of times we don't think about it. I think even right now with the state of the world and, the pandemic and all of us, we're just trying to make it to tomorrow. But I think also we're not realizing that the death industry is probably a little overwhelmed. From an outside perspective, I would assume they would be a little bit overwhelmed with everything that's been going on. And
Lord,
so,
I could
um,
go on and on about that, but it's terrible out there. It really is. Suffice to say, pick a funeral home in your town and take them a box of donuts because it's rough.
mm,
It's real bad.
be nice to your death workers, everybody, because they're hurting
There's
just as
nobody
much as
else.
our healthcare workers.
Because no one else is.
You don't even really think about it until, you have to think about it, but that's definitely one of those things that uh when it comes to where we are right now and everybody being
You
so
know, talk about
overwhelmed.
like it's been just miserable, and it's funny too. It's not fun. It's not ha ha funny. It's it's like
It's you have a dark sense of humor funny.
I'm laughing darkly at it. I finished mortuary school not long before this pandemic started. I mean, I'd been doing death care work for ever,
Hmm.
decades, but I had just started taking my funeral director's degree and stuff at that, a few years back. So here I was finishing that. And like the idea is that you finish and you go into an apprenticeship, and that's the whole process, right? You have a
Hmm.
residency and such. But instead, what happened was the Department of Health and Human Services went, hey, everyone, including like you just started today students, like everybody, you're doing this now. And you're thrown into volunteering or doing these things that you barely have your head above the water over. Like I was luckier than most given my past experience, but I have been working volunteer only since March of 2020. I haven't drawn a single paycheck. And it's sort of like, this is what you're doing and this is what you have to be doing. And when we're out there, it's not like you're a nurse helping out in another town. Nobody's covering your travel or meals or somewhere to sleep. No one is making sure you have a mask to wear or gloves to put on your hands. I've been in situations where I've seen people wearing trash bags for gowns with bandanas tied over their face, gloveless, sleeping in hallways in the morgue. Like it's totally dystopian. Like working
Oh,
24/7 for 2 weeks in volunteer spots was like not even knowing where they'll be able to eat if they're hungry. It's nuts. It's really nuts.
that's disturbing at the very least. But wow. And you most normal people who wouldn't know anybody in the, death industry wouldn't even know that because it's not publicized anywhere.
Nope. No, it is not.
Wow, that's I'm so sorry y'all are going through that. Damn.
I have so many friends out there, and I'm getting text messages from friends in the industry all hours of every day, just like, I am burning out and I can't do this anymore because it's so hard
Hmm.
and so thankless. Weird situations, like even the dumbest stuff. Isn't it the dumb things that just totally break you, right?
Yes, absolutely.
I remember last year, in like, it was sort of at the height of a particular wave and everybody was pretty burnt out, and it was like Starbucks had done that promotion where healthcare workers could like get one free drink or something.
Hmm.
And they were like, by the way, but not you though. And that was like the thing that broke so many morticians I know. Like, they just could not even get a coffee. And it was like, why?
Oh,
Why do you hate us?
and it's one of those things that we really don't think, we don't put morticians or any death workers or anything like that in with our healthcare workers, but you guys really are part of the healthcare industry because you're taking over where somebody is trying to keep them alive and you're like, okay, well, they've died. Now I'm going to take care of this because we don't want the body to infect anybody else or,
Fun,
contaminate anything if need be.
fun
Um,
fact. Fun fact, we are literally healthcare workers. We are classified as such by the federal government. And um, we're also classified as emergency response workers.
huh.
Yeah. But people don't know that. And then you sort of get like the raw end of the deal.
Well, friends who are listening to the show, spread that far and wide. Appreciate
Yeah.
your morticians and your death workers and make sure that everybody is acknowledging them and thanking them and realizing that they are part of our healthcare industry, which is not in great shape, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
So appreciate your healthcare workers and appreciate everyone from one end of the spectrum to the other end.
So true. I always say that the front line is a circle. When someone falls through, we're there to catch them.
Hmm.
We hope the doctor makes everything right and you get to go home to your family. But if they can't, we're going to give you a safe landing.
Oh, that's so sweet.
Care a lot about the families that gets care for.
That's a really incredible message. Wow. Oh, such a moving thing. Well, bringing it back from the mundane to the more magical side of things. I know that you, in your book bio, call yourself a necromancer, and I have seen a lot of other people call themselves necromancers. But for someone who does not practice necromancy of the modern sort, and they hear necromancer the first time, the first things that a lot of people think is, oh, Skyrim, necromancers, which is
Skyrim was where
silly.
you went with that. That's perfect. I'll take it.
It's a silly thing to think about, but at the same time, modern necromancy is not a practice that's really talked about in mainstream circles of paganism.
well,
So
I,
if you could
I
explain that to somebody.
Well, I'd like everyone listening to know that I'm wearing my skull pauldrons and I have like a skull bikini on and I'm glowing green and purple. Just- that's the image, right?
Yes.
Oh my God.
Like a
I always
cross
think of
between a
Diablo.
hooded, like a black hooded person and a hag raven. That's like the two that came to mind with that.
See, I always sort of harken back to the words of Daniel Ogden in Greek and Roman Necromancy, which is a book I'm very fond of. It's a little bit academic, but if that's your thing, it's super cool.
Hmm.
Um, there were points in history where necromancy would not be a word used distinguishably from any death magic. Any anytime I say I practice necromancy, there's always some nerd. Hearts to everybody who was this nerd. It's like, well, actually, necromancy is divination through the use of, the dead or whatever.
Hmm.
And then someone else will interrupt them and mansplain or something that Actually, that's theomancy because nobody's working with corpses. It's actually theomancy is divination with shades and ghosts and stuff. But historically, necromancy would have been used to mean anybody doing any kind of death magic,
Hmm.
really. Pretty broad, and that's how I use it as well. But I think we all sort of get hung up at the same point in history, about the 1500s. Up until there, necromancy was such an ordinary part of practice that it's really a better question to ask, why aren't we all doing that now?
Right.
Because it seems kind of weird that we're not doing that. But, Catholics like their things to be their things. And despite the fact that they're doing the fucking weirdest necromancy ever, pardon my French, everyone.
Oh no,
You can
you're
bleep
welcome to
me.
cuss on the show.
You
I
can
cuss on the
bleep me
show.
if you need to. Okay,
Nope.
I'll try to
We
be.
all cuss. It's cool.
Well, the fucking weirdest necromancy comes out of Catholics. So let's just talk about it. We have like bedazzled corpses, and I don't know what cosmic joke it is to have Galileo's middle finger bone on permanent display, but here we are. So
Wow.
yeah, Catholics are just like doing some shit over there with corpses. They're like, this person is a saint, so we'll go dig them up and sniff them to see if they smell like flowers, and then we're just gonna cram them in a glass box for everyone to poke out with a stick. That's weird, right?
That's weird. That is
And
definitely weird, and probably, in today's world, 50 shades of illegal.
it's definitely 50 shades of illegal, but nevertheless. So, air quotes, pagans of the time thought this stuff was fucked up. It was definitely weird compared to what they were doing, which was, ancestor worship and more sort of service oriented death magic. Necromancy at particular points in history, and everyone listening should know that I'm relying on extremely European white people basis for anything I say. I try and stick in my lane, stay there real hard. Most of my practices derive from early Greek practices, arguably. But that aside, your friendly neighborhood necromancer in ancient Greece was not really that different from your modern day mortician if they also happen to be a witch.
Hmm.
We're talking about people that served their communities, helped families process recent deaths, cared for the recently deceased, prepared bodies for burial, really took care of families and did the magic that they needed in those times, and
Hmm.
continued doing the kinds of magic that helped them talk to the dead and give to the dead. So it does take a hard turn left somewhere around, Catholic fuckery.
Hmm.
What happened was a bit of a propaganda campaign, if you want to be honest about it, where it was kind of like what we're doing is good and nice with our weird like finger bone magic or whatever. And what these people are doing is not actually necromancy, probably. They're not actually talking to the dead or saints and stuff. They are summoning demons who are pretending to be their dead loved ones. And that sort of became the party line for a while. Most of the grimoires that you see today that focus on the topic of necromancy were written by popes, priests, very prominent Catholics. And that's where you get all the really baddie stuff too.
Right.
Then that sort of trickles down into like 1800s era, like Levy and Dee and Francis Barrett, and they're all like, I'm still a white guy Catholic and I have some strong feels about stuff, and I'm only doing the good kind of necromancy. So it's cool. So, literally, Elvis Levy says at a point, I believe in transcendental doctrine. Don't quote me on that. I might be wrong as hell, but it's one of those. It says that there are two kinds of necromancy, the good and the bad, and sort of defines the difference between them. The good kind is, prayers and invocations, and the bad kind is, blood and burning incense and those kinds of things. It's
Hmm.
like, okay, cool. And then we see things like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
Hmm.
When we see a book like that come out, it sort of science fictionalizes um, working with the dead, and it's very ghoulish, and we're reanimating someone. And that leaves us with certain kinds of ideas as we trickle into like later 1950s sci-fi and B movies,
Hmm.
which by the time we have things like Dungeons and Dragons begins to look a very particular sort of way.
Yes.
So everything those fabulous Catholics did to like super cool Greek necromancers just continued to get worse. So I would say that I'm not really that different from any witch who does death care work
Hmm.
and works primarily with the dead. I'm just using a word accurately about it.
That is very valid. And that's something that I think that we should be talking more about because of the fact that we really should start separating where some of the old magic kind of got lost because of the spread of Christianity
Exactly.
and bringing it back to its original life. Obviously, we're not going to be practicing it exactly the same way because, we don't do things the way that, we would have in, 14th, 13th, 12th centuries.
Mhm.
But, when you start to really look at how it was then and then how you can adapt it to the modern era, that's something that I think that we really should be looking at because a lot of that's going to eventually get lost and we may never find it again once it's lost.
You know,
And that's something that we shouldn't lose.
I always say to people that they should really pause and think about the fact that in necromancy and death work, death magic is really kind of the last bastion of othering and sort of superstition and taboo within pagan communities, even perpetrated by pagans themselves.
Hmm.
And again, I'm using that umbrella term so broadly, just like bear with that. But I think that if everyone paused for a moment to realize that all those weird, oogie feelings they have about it are absolutely things that were drilled into their heads by Catholics and Christians and those sorts of things that you might sort of reassess your position on it.
Hmm.
I teach a class pretty often on reading spirit boards, and I talk a lot about the practice. And one thing that always surprises people, always, never fails to surprise, is that you can't find a single reference to spirit boards or Ouija boards being something people were scared of or concerned about or nervous about prior to a single day. Do you know what that day was?
Mm-mm.
The release of The Exorcist in theaters.
Oh, yes.
An entire generation of, aging house parents went, those are very scary, taught their children to believe that, and we have carried it into now. Prior to then, it was such a common, ordinary, wholesome family activity that Norman Rockwell painted a couple playing Ouija for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post for the May issue. Think about that, or a spring issue.
Just spending your Saturday evening with, your significant other talking to the dead.
Right. It was such an ordinary activity.
And I think it should be an ordinary activity. And, that's kind of one of the things that Kyle and I talk a lot about on Chaos and Shadow is about the destigmatization of spirit boards, all spirit boards, and divination tools in general. Because when it comes to the spirit board, it's literally just a board, and you're basically the conduit for the energy as far as we've known that that's the way that that's supposed to work. And it if you're the one who is freaked out and saying, oh, it's going to be a demon, yeah, you're probably going to talk to something that's not very nice or that's going to masquerade as that because you've invited that. But ultimately, if you go into it and be like, hey, I just want to sit down and talk to something, or anyone who's willing to talk to me and just have a conversation, it's usually a pretty fun time.
I could go down like an entire rabbit hole about the kinds of experiences people have with those boards and um, well, working with the dead in general and sort of how that relates back. But that would take up all our time. We'll have to do this again sometime.
We'll have to have just a Ouija board conversation.
Yes, we'll have to do that again soon. But I would say this, and I say this often, and I really hope your listeners will take this to heart. The dead are still human after all. Imagine that you're standing in your local neighborhood Walmart or something, some crowded place filled with probably non enjoyable people that you'd want to spend your time with. Of all the people standing in that building, probably none of them are a Ted Bundy, by which I mean someone truly evil.
Hmm.
And probably none of them are a Florence Nightingale either, by which I mean someone truly benevolent. Everyone is some shade of gray, just lonely and selfishly inclined and just trying to get by and exist and do the best that they can.
Hmm.
The dead generally want the same things that you want, and I do think that they generally are well intended. Well intended doesn't always work out, but I do think that's worth considering. The odds of you encountering something truly malevolent are so vastly slim as to be silly to worry about.
Yes, I completely agree with that. And I think that the other thing too is whenever you come across someone that is from the other side, wherever they may be, whatever form they may be in, you just really have to kind of go back to that whole thing of if you're going to treat them like shit, they're probably going to turn around and treat you like shit or not talk to you at all.
But I think that harkens back to our Walmart analogy. If
Yeah,
you're crappy to the person at the checkout line, they're going to be crappy back because
absolutely.
why wouldn't they be, right?
I mean, you don't want to go into, any conversation with any entity of any shape or form, whether they be human on this side of the plane or the other side. Don't go into it treating them like crap. You
We
wouldn't
probably
you wouldn't treat your person at Walmart like crap. At least you shouldn't be, because if you are, then shame on you. That's
you're the
bad.
bad guy. That's
You're the bad guy. Don't treat them like crap. They're just there to do their job, earn their paycheck, and go home. They don't want to be treated like crap. And they're
we
not going to treat you like crap if you are nice to them. They're going to
we've
do their
all
best to be nice to you.
we've all had that piece of advice, right? If you go into an experience with a negative attitude, you're probably going to have a negative
Yep.
experience.
Mhm.
And that works two ways. I mean, just like going into a conversation with a living person with a bad attitude will not turn out well. I mean, the same is true of the dead. They have
Yes.
opinions and feelings. They're still people.
It's so very, very true.
I
So,
always, I'm always telling people, don't forget that they are people.
mhm.
I think that's such a basic fundamental comment that gets lost. It's like, your loved one dies, you sit by grandma's bedside and they pass away and you're very sad and you wish they could have hung on a little longer. But if at midnight the same day you saw them in the hallway, it'd be frightening. You might consider it something scary to be rid of. And what is the
Mhm.
difference between grandma alive and grandma dead? What fundamentally changed? Nothing.
Corporeal body, that's about it.
Correct. So let's all remember that the dead are somebody's, grandparent.
Absolutely beautiful message that, we can definitely take away with this. And, for any listeners out there, if this is something that you're interested in, if you're interested in learning more about necromancy or death work or any of that, definitely go and I would say start if you're going there. It's a long road, because with any sort of paganism, you should always do all your research, but start with Mortellus's book, because you are going to get a wealth of information about all the ways that we should be practicing our death customs as pagans.
I
So
did want
check that out, everyone.
I did want to take a moment to say something I'm pretty excited about.
Yes, please share all of your projects, anything that, you want to talk about that you can talk about. I know some authors, when they've got projects in the work, they can't talk about it because it's still in the works with publication. But yeah, tell us everything that you've got going on because we would love to follow all of your work.
So my first book, of course, it's a reference sort of book, and it talks about how to plan for death and how to host and manage funerary rituals and rites for your loved ones. And it's a great book if you are in the position of being clergy or someone who has a loved one who could die, or if you're someone who could die. So it's for everyone. But
Mhm.
my next book, I just got the release date, which is September 8th, is titled The Bones Fall in a Spiral, A Guide to Necromancy and the Magic of Death. And it
Oh,
is really a handbook, start to finish, of what my practice looks like, and I hope it will be meaningful to someone out there. It has a comprehensive spell book and set of rituals that I think anybody could get something out of, but it also delves into a lot of topics about the dead and classifying incorporeal entities and sort of figuring out communicating and who you might be talking to, which I think is very useful for anyone in the paranormal field or who
hmm.
works with hauntings or the dead in any sort of meaningful way.
That sounds incredible. I literally just made a note of that, and that is going to be on my list to pick up this fall. You said that's coming out in September?
It is, and in fact, I happen to know that it's already hiding on Amazon for pre-order if you search for it.
Yay! And that's going to be through Llewellyn again?
Yes.
Awesome.
It doesn't have any, like, it's not a full page on Amazon, but it's up there.
That's okay. We always look forward to that. So if you want to go ahead and get your pre-orders in right now, you guys can go over to Amazon and get those in. And if not, as it gets closer to September, obviously they will populate the Amazon page a lot more.
For sure.
And it'll have the pretty cover design and your synopsis and all that good stuff. So you can pre-order that. Or if you're somebody that likes to wait till after it's fully released, wait till September and it will be out. I'm sure we will have Mortellus back before then because I definitely want to have a conversation about the magic of Ouija boards and why we should be using them. So we'll definitely have to have you back by for that because that's going to be a good time.
I would like that very much.
Well, Martellus, thank you so much for joining us today. And everyone, please go check out Martellus. Oh, before we let everybody go, where can they find you? Do you have Instagram? I know you have Twitter, but
I
do you have
do
Instagram and TikTok, any of that good stuff?
I have Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. You can find me any of those places by searching A Crow and the Dead or Mortellus. On Facebook, I have a group called A Crow and the Dead, which is a fun little place to talk about death and necromancy and ask questions and share silly memes with the Grim Reaper in them proudly. um, I do have a website at mortellus.com, and I encourage everyone who might be looking for a small way to get involved in death and this pandemic to go check out fundthefuneral.com, which is a website where you can donate directly to funerals that families have posted. Think about it like a GoFundMe with no middleman. You're directly contributing to their
Nice.
exact funeral. So
Very nice. And you also make candles and stuff, don't you?
I do. I have a shop on my website where I sell handmade candles, which they're all ritual candles, which I also think are lovely. So they're like necromantic Bath and Body Works. but
But they don't
but
smell like dead bodies, everybody. They smell divine from everything I've seen.
they do have a unique feature though. They're all wood wick candles, and I cut the wicks from used caskets.
Oh,
Yes,
that's neat.
formerly occupied by a body casket. Um, I've also got all kinds of necromantic ritual goods there: incenses, corpse water, spell kits, and other fun stuff. So I'm all
Awesome.
about responsibly sourced, sustainable, ethical necromantic goods. People need a place to find things that they can trust the source of. So I try and make that available.
That is great. That is absolutely great. So everybody, make sure you go and follow Mortellus. They are a beautiful human. You need to go follow them on Twitter, pick up a copy of their books. Make sure you pre-order the next book coming out. You also pick up a copy of Do I Have to Wear Black, and follow all of their amazing stuff through all of their social media stuff, which will be linked in the bio. So thank you everybody for joining us today, and we will see you all next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.